Cool. So we left off somewhere around here when we had just started making our character controllers. Um, Today I'd like to go through some of the feedback on the input system. We didn't really get to that. I promised that I'd make a video, which I'm still planning on doing, that integrates the new input system with Bolt in 2020. There's an older, or rather, there's a newer version of, or a more integrated way of doing that already with the new input system, or rather with Unity 2021's visual scripting. The visual scripting in 2021 is a built-in, so it's no longer an external tool that you, well, it's still a package that you need to install, but it's no longer under your own assets. So that's got a slightly different way of going about it. I think, I hope you can just back up your existing graphs and open them in the visual scripting editor. I'm actually not sure. I still need to test that. But for now, we're going to stick with the LTS version of Unity. So it's going to be Bolt and Unity 2020. Obviously, if you can build or tap into the input manager via code without using Bolt, then that's still entirely up to you. I'm going to show you this sort of the simplest way of hooking up your Animator controller so that people that don't do any programming and are more interested in the animation side of things can also get their characters to move around and do things. Okay, then I'll show you a couple of Cinemachine things, like just how to get started, what the different types of cameras are. That's actually the topic for today, was Cinemachine, or cameras and control schemes. So the control scheme thing, I think, is quite complex, and it's something that we really need to address once we have our entire character in place with all the animation, all the blends. You should certainly start thinking about it already, but I thought that maybe we'd get back to that in more detail, since we need to submit a controller prefab next week. So the controller prefab is basically taking all your animations and your animator controller, putting that in a prefab, perhaps with all the maybe you've made a prefab of your character already, so it might contain some scripts or graphs. You can include those as well. But essentially, I'm more concerned with the animations and how they flow onto each other, and what your character is capable of doing, and also how well it can do that. So that's the 20% controller prefab. That's part of your marks and assessment. Okay, so it's quite a large portion of that. So we'll look at some Cinemachine stuff, but just sort of, again, getting started, what components to use, input system, kind of getting started, looking at how do we fire off the events, and then we'll look at a few more tools in the animator itself, like root motion, that we can choose to use, or rather using a rigid body or a constraint or a physics-based system, and then animation events, layers, and masks that you could also potentially use. There's some clever ways of using layers to override things and have your character do like a wide array of sort of instant actions that don't necessarily depend on what the rest of the animator is doing. Perhaps, layering those animations and getting your character to different things, or resetting to a more like an idle sort of animator that looks like he's alive. Kind of give it over to the animation trees. Okay, input system, and yeah, obviously there'll be a class recording, and then for next week, like I mentioned, your character controller and animator, or your character and your animator controller, and all your animations need to be submitted as a Unity package. Okay, so I've yet to publish this actual assignment. I'll make the deadline Friday, most likely next week, so you'll have a good week to work on it, and the other Monday class will kind of get the assignment at the same time. So yeah, I'll publish all of that tomorrow. And then we had a Ludum Dare this long weekend. I don't know how your guys' Weekends went, and I hope they were restful. If you do a Ludum Dare, it's not exactly restful. There were two teams essentially. I don't have the mirror boards at hand, but both teams tried valiantly. I'm not sure if both eventually got to submit. I think I passed out on like early Tuesday morning, an hour before the submission deadline. I couldn't take it anymore. But it was fun, nevertheless. And I did a little bit of a speed run just on the work that I did. And the only reason why I'm showing you this is because it's kind of exactly in line with what we're doing now. Setting up an animator for a controller. Now, I didn't, we sort of brainstormed the concept. It was called Deeper. For those of you that don't know, I'm sure you all know by now what Ludum Dare is. I think I had it open over here. So yeah, it's a game jam competition that runs for 72 hours if you're a group, but I think there's a 48-hour individual challenge as well. There's rules to it. Everyone submits. It's a global effort, so you just need to say that you're participating, and then you sort of post your progress as you go. There's also a voting event, so you can go and play. Most of these games are available free to play. You can go and check it out and see if there's anything worth playing, and also vote on it, and then sort of there'll be a winner in the end of the day. And I don't know if you actually get something. You used to get sort of a Steam greenlight agreement of sorts, but I'm not sure what you get nowadays. Maybe just brownie points. So our concept was to let me just see. Okay, to create a sort of a well, you'll actually get the gist of it. So we brainstormed it, and we sort of spoke about it, chat about it. Obviously, typical Discord banter. Had some ideas of parallel universes and making holes in the environment, and then sort of reference Bomberman, dinosaurs, Minesweeper, and everyone sort of falls into so use Cinemachine as well. This is just some really simple or rudimentary setup for the camera, getting different heights in case you want to zoom, setting up shaders for effects, integrating those shaders into the animation, so that your animator basically plays back all the animations, whether they're 3D or 2D or everything's in one animation. So I'll show you how to do that today as well. Testing the animator then. So sort of limiting the parameters as well, because it's a Ludum Dare. You don't want to make a controller that's too complicated. So yeah, all the character really needed to do was jump onto other blocks, pretend to be a block, and then blow up, be a mine or something. I think the gameplay was still meant to be tested. I think we anticipated that it would be fun, and I don't know if we really got to a point where it was fun, but I think everyone's still pretty excited about the process, and might get together and wrap it up again. So yeah, then the code was that, I think that other colored cube that was in there earlier. So this is already with the controller script intact, and you can see the character sort of bounce around and move around like it's supposed to. This is just my, and then I kept on falling off the world. But this is just my section of it. The layer generation was built by Walter, and Jared did the multiplayer server setup. And yeah, there's still a bunch of things that are sort of everywhere. I don't have all of their screen recordings, but it was fun, needless to say. Cool. So on that project, just quickly, what I thought would be worth sharing with you is the animations that are made for this player character are fairly simple. Like I said, there's just a hop, and then there's a sort of a dash, and then him exploding. There's the mobile version of the character that needs to move around, and a static one And oh wait, this is actually an entirely different controller. So this controller was set up so that it just showcases the animation. So it's actually put in a sequence where this character kind of, because how I just realized it, I saw I reused boot and hop a couple of times. So this character currently does this one sequence, and it's just to sort of show off, okay, there's obviously something wrong with that shader. Sometimes it doesn't load the first time. Yeah, so there it's better. So this is made for an entirely different portion of the game. So if you want your character to be in a certain state in the beginning, like if you don't have control of your character yet, maybe he's just showing off what he can do, or flexing his muscles, basically, kind of like all the RPG kind of games would have your character selection area, and then you would have these sort of paper dolls that move around, and you could dress them, and, or maybe just see your character in action, like with Diablo comes to mind, where they're all sort of standing around a fire or something like that. So the actual controller, and remember you can switch these out at runtime, so you can actually build multiple controllers for your game as well. Just be sure that you include all of those if you do export them. Okay, so there's a bunch of controllers actually, and the actual Animator controller looked like this. So that's even simpler, although this is the base layer. Okay, so it's sort of, at the moment, it's set up to be overridden by the top layer. Okay, so the base layer, all it does is boot up and then wait for whether it's mobile or not. Okay, the boot up animation, like the animations don't really play here because they're generic animations, they're not, so you can't use any of the humanoid stuff, but I can show you in here. So remember the distinction between the animator and the animation. So the animator is just the component that pulls or calls all the animations, and the animations themselves can be a multitude of things, right? So you don't have to, like, this could be your 3D animation or your character walking around. I just need to have an actual reference model or a model in the scene selected so that I can actually view the animations play back. Okay, so this is everything that's in the animator will be listed over here. So as soon as you've added a animation clip to the animator, even if it's not linked up, it'll add it to your animation window here, or options, so that you can go and actually select that animation and go and tweak it. So there's a lot of this that happened, setting up the specific actions. Yeah, sorry, that effect shader seems to be broken. Let me just save it. It is saved. Maybe that doesn't really matter, but okay. Let's see another one. Okay, so that's the static, and that's the in fact, the static is literally just played forward and backwards. So it's actually one animation that I'm using to just switch on a different, and this is kind of tricky, like trickery rather. I'm not actually turning that cube into another object. I'm simply switching on meshes. So it's kind of like you would do in stop motion, where you just replace the model with other models. The animation itself is an Alembic file. Okay, so all the movement that you see on the cube was actually done in Blender. Sorry, I can open that model. But it followed the same principle. So it's literally just not worrying about the source of the animation so much anymore, but taking the animation that you have in Unity and then working with that and layering things on top of that. It's like adding juice, I suppose. It should be in models, that would make sense. And then Just want to see what this file format is. So the Alembic files are what you export. And this is, again, this is a little bit unconventional. So the animations were all pre-animated, but they're just metables. So they're just objects moving around. And because we actually wanted this sort of topology to blend into each other, well, I just wanted to try it. We tried a Unity add-on called Klexels that's supposed to do it as well. So it kind of looks like Chicken Run, or those kind of stop motion animations. So the reason why there's no rig or anything is just because it wasn't necessary. So the animations were all done in a sequence, and the loops were just set up like that, and then you export one basic timeline with all the vertex data baked into the Alembic file. So the Alembic file is something that specifically was developed by, I think, Industrial Lights and Magic, that actually transfers data that wouldn't normally be shared between applications, can now be shared using Alembic. So vertex data, or because it gets rid of the rigging and all of that stuff, it shares the vertex data. It can share particle systems and hair and things like that as well, to different degrees of success. Obviously, if you share, or if it gets too complex, then you lose some of the elements. But thankfully, all of this translated into something fairly similar. I must say, some of the stomping animations in here tend to get a little rigid. Like there's a lot of bouncing and a lot of so I think there's a frame rate difference between what Blender baked and what Unity brought in, and that's why you get a little bit of that bouncy animation. Okay, so back to the animations. All of those animations are then accessible. What I showed you last week, I think towards the end of the class, was just how to get animations separated from your models in case you do need to tweak them. So the model itself, in this case, was an Alembic file, and the Alembic file only had 2 animations as part of it. The one is essentially just playing through the entire sequence of events. Okay, so those are all events, and the other one is just a timeline that plays through the. So I think if I just select that, it's not actually playing it through, but it's literally just all the animation that was baked from the start to the end. So it's one single timeline. Now, because this format doesn't really allow me to go and select the type of animation, or there's no import settings when it comes to the animation. So I can't go and set whether it loops or whether the root is baked into it or anything like that. I need to go and treat each animation as a sort of a sub component of the timeline, basically. So I needed to duplicate each one of these. So I go from here, I start from here, then I duplicate the animation, and then when I duplicate it, then I can name it, so I can look at whatever this is supposed to be doing at the moment. The reason why I can't preview this animation on my character is because it's not part of the animator. So if I drag this in here now, so export anim time, and I select my model in the scene, I can now go and reference that export anim time. Okay, so there you can see all the animations that play in sequence. So then all I did was, because I wanted the time to stay static, I would just add keyframes or whatever. So whatever I want to happen within this animation, I can go and layer here now. So if I wanted to say switch on a 2D effect or something like that, I could very easily, so there's this other cube, right, that's meant to make effects, and if by default it's switched off, so the mesh render is off, and that's when it's on. The cube in itself, I think, needs some tweaking in terms of the shader. So I set up some shaders with parameters that you can animate. So the effect shader, basically, it's a mess, guys. So this is like Ludum Dare kind of vibes. It's just like you throw whatever at it until you find something that kind of works. It's like you don't get a lot of time to pre-plan and package things very nicely. So all I did here was basically combine a line shader, procedural shader, with something like a houndstooth or a zigzag, and then just tweak the opacity and blending modes until I got something like that, and that seemed to do what I wanted it to. Created some floats and variables similar to what you would do in any animator. In any case, you know, we need the parameters to drive these values to be public so that we can animate them. And then in the in the animation itself, you can then go and animate these things. So the first thing here is the render, the mesh renderer. So I want that to switch on. I don't want it to be on by default. So when I start recording, I'm going to say, okay, mesh renderer needs to switch on now. Maybe it should switch on like a little bit later. So frame 30, and not be on over here already. Then I have that object appearing, and I don't want to make the appearances obvious, so I need to tweak the shader. And the moment that I drag any of these values, because I'm an auto key, those options of parameters to animate become available to me. Okay, so something like that probably. Found that you need to animate this offset from, I think, from 1 to something like -3 over the period of time. So I'm just going to do that for that amount of time. Bring this back, bring that, actually that still needs to be like that, and -3. And if I wanted to scale something, like over here it pops up, then I can also just do very simple type animations, obviously, just, you know, scaling objects, moving objects in time. This is all very crude now. Okay, so that was my first keyframe. You obviously need a start keyframe for that, so I can go and scale the thing back to what it was. I did make a keyframe, scale the position, but I wanted to make it later. So I can move these keyframes around, stretch them out if I want to. See, so the moment it becomes visible, okay, it becomes visible over there. Okay, I feel like my animation's a bit offset here. Well, you get the gist of it. That's not very well animated currently. Shader looks like it's a little dodgy. Still not blue. Oh, because that's not. So that's basically it, but if you get the timing right, like in this dash animation, you should just be able to hit play over here, and you can see, okay, so that's it dashing, probably not the best example. The stomping one is also kind of cool. So you get that timing just right, and then you have sort of a motion blur or something like that, or a gun flare, or muzzle flare. Anything in the world that sort of matches the animation, that makes the animation better than what it normally is. Like if there's a kind of a pop or a flash when a character unlocks a door, or if they have speed lines when they kick or something like that. That could also be cool. Or trails as they swipe a blade. Now, to get sounds to play on these animations and at the perfect time, you want to add events to them and then call them in code. So adding events to animations are fairly simple as well. We'll just go to wherever that particular sound or whatever needs to be. I'm just going to use my old reference here, and the moment that happens, it looks like he's sort of teleported. So I want the sound to be triggered there, or the event to be triggered. Maybe it's also a point where I swap the model out, or I kill off the character, or whatever, switch off the collider or anything like that. So any type of event, doesn't need to be a sound event, but any event that needs to happen that can't just be animated by adding visuals or adding the parameters. So in this case, I'll create an event. You'll see that event, depending on what is available on what scripts are on the object, like that sort of dictates the functions that you have. So if you have a script, or if you don't have any scripts, you'll have, I think, limited functions. I can't remember what those are. I can quickly add an event to something else that doesn't have a script on it, I suppose. Like, actually, where is that script? I don't actually even see a script, so maybe these are the default ones. Would you go check? Yeah, I think maybe these are the default ones. In that case, if you want more functionality, or if you want to tap into it outside of Unity script, the alternative would be I'll just find one of these animations that I can edit. So my window, animation. Okay, so you can see most of these are read-only, so that's when you get them from an external source and you don't need to go and tweak any of the animations. So for this, it's fairly I mean, I can't add an event to a read-only animation. I need to go and add it to the model. Okay, so because it's not allowing me to change any of these keys, remember what we did was we took one of the existing animations. So in this case, any of the ones that are on this character. Like this, say talking seems like a good example. Okay, so the talking clip doesn't allow me to edit it in here. It wouldn't allow me to change anything here or create events. So what I can do is either find that animation. Okay, so it's Xbox talking. I think that's the origin of the animation. And then I need to go into the animation over here, talking, and then I can go and add an event in here. So I can scrub through it over here, over there, and then the moment that he starts talking, I can go and add a function. So a new event called, I don't know, start talk. Okay, if I apply that, you can go to your animator and now find that event over there. It's still a read-only file. You've just applied it to sort of import level. So these events can, well, they'll be hardbound to the source file. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it would be to take that talking animation and just duplicating that. Now that's a clip that allows me to go and change it on its own. You can see it's now independent of the model. So this is talking custom. It's my custom animation, and if I apply that to the animator, remember it's the best way of doing that. I'm just going to drag it in here, talking custom. Then it'll be available for me to go and tweak in the animator. So I can switch this now to, let's just grab the character again. You'll see talking custom is now no longer a read-only file, and you can go and tweak that event. That was the event that we created on the previous version, so it's still there. You can now move it around, and you'll see that there's start talking isn't supported because there's no script on there to do start talking. It's not picked up as a variable at the moment. And now I have zero functionality over this. There's, again, yeah, there's no scripts on there. Just try something quick. So I just want to make an animation on an object that has a bolt component on it. Okay, so that's what it looks like if you can tap into the additional bolt events. This would probably be the easiest way to trigger anything outside, by just triggering it with a string and then I think sort of broadcasting it, and picking it up in another piece of script. Okay, well, let's leave events there for now. In the meantime, you can go and set them up. You know where to add them. You understand read-only and editable or customizable animation scripts. Or clips, rather. Cool. Now, the next thing that I wanted to speak to you about, Paulo also shared some components and bolt methods during the last class. I think I just dragged them in sort of recklessly into our into the flow graph. This is, as far as I understand, meant to be used in conjunction with a camera setup, so that your character moves or responds in relation to the camera instead of independent of it. But I still need to go through that in more detail, maybe ask Paulo to give us a little bit of a rundown of it at some point. But I think this and the bolt methods that we need to share with you in the 2020 version of Unity sort of go hand in hand in there. What I've done in other instances, if I just need to test character interaction before actually building a character controller, I normally just set up a little bit of a hints panel, kind of like just like testing cues, or testing keys rather. So that code looks super rudimentary. It is part of the repo that I shared with you last week, so that link's still valid. Bolt was updated now, so I think it's Bolt, and I'll update it to visual scripting if we do make a switch to 2021, but I doubt that that'll happen within this module. It'll be a little risky for us to switch midterm, so I think this is, which Bolt version is this? Okay, so in this project that I just shared, or just updated, you'll find a number of scripts that are mostly sort of halfway there. So they're not final controllers and you can't really use them as that, but they're sort of a lazy person's tool set, which is basically what it's basically what it is, and what I am. So what I would do is sort of build on components that I think would be interesting to test out and then try and combine them. So some of these are like hybrids between very standard input axis controllers to way more. So if we just go to the scenes, there's 2D axes. There's a start scene, which is kind of blank. I think this is just a very basic character controller, super rudimentary. Let me just see if this actual Cinemachine camera is in there. Cinemachine is activated though. But this is not, this is just a static. Let's see, transposer. Oh, it's a lock transposer. Okay, so nothing's happening with this. It's a fairly basic static lockdown camera. We can go and play. We'll do the sort of the offset stuff and play with the dampening, and I'll show you what all of these settings do, as well as all the different types of transposers that you get, different types of cameras that you get, or sort of presets that you get in Cinemachine, and how to at least frame your character, because it's also useful to, while you're working on the animations, just get a camera that kind of looks at the character the way that you intend your game camera to look at the character, and that way you can get a better sense of whether the animations are actually doing what they're supposed to do. Okay, so that's the start scene. Root motion is a pre-made controller that uses root motion animation. So again, you'll see and find all the scripts related to these characters in here as well. So this one is basically just, as far as I remember, so there's little examples of sort of different controllers throughout, and it might be useful for you to just to look at what's the code doing in this instance, and what components are actually added to the character as well. So in this case, we're literally just getting the this is still using both input managers, so to speak. So it's just getting the get raw axes, and it's getting the input buttons as per the old system. The workaround for the input manager is basically setting the input that you're getting from the input new input system as a variable, and then replacing these actual inputs with variables that are getting read through the other system. So very little of the underlying logic will actually change. Some of these parameters are specific to the animator, although in general they are all set up the way that I sort of advise that you go about setting up locomotion trees, where all your sort of standard walking and strafing and walking slowly happens at 1, and anything that needs to be accelerated happens at 2. So we just work with whole numbers at the moment, and what it's doing here is just looking for whether we're sprinting or strafing. Can go into each of these, and I think what I'd rather do is, like, give you these as examples instead of going through each and every setup in too much detail. Find an example, see what's useful, see what you want to change. Not all of them are fully functional, but I think you'll get the idea of where it breaks and why it breaks. It's mainly just because they haven't been fully completed. So there's a raw input axis one that uses root motion. Then we have a combat controller, which is kind of very humanoid at the moment, but it has sort of special abilities to climb ladders and take cover, arm and unarm. And we'll look at some of the layer setups on how combat functions with a base movement controller. So I'll show you kind of what's happening over here. I'm going to get back to layers, but just so that we do a quick run through of what else is in here. If any of these ring a bell, if they're any at all useful to you, by all means. Then there's a IK controller, which is also something that we'll get back to later on. This character has just been set up with an IK rig. So it's not even a specific rig. What it's actually doing is it's just visualizing the bones that you have in embedded in the model. So whatever rig that model used, those are the ones that you're tagging here and actually just visualizing. So if you go to the player, then you'll see under that it now has Unity rig components and then constraints, and they have these components. Well, those are constraints, but normally on the base layer you have the weighting. So kind of like an animation layer, you have weighting that you can tell the rig how much it's supposed to influence the character. And then you have these constraints that you can set up for IK. So that's just one per arm there. In this case, what it's doing, it'll play your animations, but then while it's playing, you can grab like these components. Excuse this. I think this this camera is just whack. I think it's also a pretty basic Cinemachine camera, but it's just on free look. So here already it's playing the animation, but I can still control the arm. Now for IK or for arms, you probably want an up vector as well to make sure that the arm doesn't fold or bend the wrong way like it's doing over here. But it's pretty cool that you can have real-time influence over your animations as they play, regardless of what the animation, whether the animation's read-only or whatever. You're simply blending movement on top of that, and procedural movement at that. So you can now go and find and get and set the position of these control objects so that your character actually grabs it properly. Or if you have that annoying foot slide thing, or maybe you're running upstairs and your feet aren't equal, you can actually do a ground detection on those. So it's not currently set up, but we'll do raycasting soon as well. You'll notice that we're touching on some of the elements from next week, like animation events, layers, masks, and raycasting, but not in its entirety. So we're doing a little bit of a blend of the two, because I feel like animation events and understanding the animator better will help you produce a controller prefab, more so than the input system and the camera control schemes. Those are sort of secondary. So I'm just flipping the script a little bit. Okay. Lastly, we have root motion, we have the combat controller, we have IK system, then we have 2D axes, which is I think just a 2.5D one. I don't know how far this one was developed. They sort of spawn off student projects, so if you have any sort of concerns or anything that is particularly holding you back in creating your controller, what I normally do is I'll sort of demo it and adopt it and try and make an example of it. In this case, trying to remember what I changed to make this a 2D controller, other than the fact that the camera is somewhat orthographic. This doesn't look 2D at all to me. Yeah, no, there's very little substance there. So if anyone's doing a 2D platformer controller and you need help, then I have an opportunity to build on that. And then there's the camera controller, which is a little bit more focused on the point and click, but also, okay, so this controller is a little bit different again. It uses a nav mesh agent. So instead of just inputting values or getting input values from your input controller and sending that to the animator, what we're doing is actually reading the movement of the rigid body on the character to inform the animation. So it's almost like the character is driving itself, because all that you're doing with a nav mesh agent is telling it where to go. The nav mesh agent controls the speed and the velocity and the path that it takes to get there. And now what we're doing with the animator is it's simply taking that information that's generated by the nav mesh agent and applying that to the animator. So you'll see that this graph is a little bit different. It's looking for click events, and well, based on the layer that you're clicking on, it could also change things, like whether you're supposed to attack or whether you can go there or not. And then, like I said, it just takes the values from the navmesh agent and then sets those values on the animator to make it move around, which results in basically something like this. So it's also a sort of a free look camera, and I think it has a little bit of a mouse scroll option there, so that you can zoom in and out of your view, and then it's point and click, so if you just click anywhere then your character kind of runs there, or walks there depending on how far it is. If it's further away, he's more likely to run. And what else? Oh, there's a camera switch in here, so if I press E, I think oh no, it's not E. I don't think that script is happening, but let me see from the animator's perspective. We'll go into this now. So we'll go into the cinema machine settings and the cameras in a minute. That's what's in the project in a nutshell. So you can download this and look at any of the scripts. The only other one that I want to show you, that if you're not at all familiar with what I'm referencing here, what I'm talking about, and you haven't programmed anything and you're not comfortable with any sort of programming, there's also a script here that literally just fires off. So it's just called shortcuts, and all this shortcuts script does, if you have Bolt installed, is it literally just looks for any keyboard input. There's a little bit of axes input here that just drives values on your animator. So this is simply to fire off events on your animator. Now this animator happens to be a little bit more complex, so it has things like action triggers, get hit triggers, crouching, blocking, death, aiming, injured. Those are all the animation events. So if you do want to keep some of these controls, you'll see that they're mapped to the UI. If you want to change that, all you need to do is make sure that that element, if it's a bool, then you copy this element and you type your boolean from your animator in there. And if it's a trigger, then you can use this method. If it's a float, then you can use this method. There's even a random event and a, what is this? Also floats. There's some integers. I think that just convert to floats. Okay, so that would be sort of a very bare bone controller that simply performs the actions that are called by the or needed by the animator. So in terms of animation events, layers and masks, we can still have a closer look at the layers and masks used in some of these examples. What layers are basically capable of doing is they can override, based on their weight, which can also be dynamically set, they can override the layers on other layers basically. They can also do additive animation on top of that existing layer. Now with additive animation, you just need to remember that whatever you're adding to it, it's going to be sort of playing both animations at the same time. So if your keys aren't like planned to overlap or planned to play on top of each other, then they're most likely not going to give you the results that you want. You can also sync two different animation components. If they're exactly the same, you can sync them, and then you can just swap out the animations. So the animation, the animator fires off at the same time, or both layers fire off at the same time. So that can also be useful. In this case, like I was explaining earlier on, I simply had the animation turn from a solid object to a static object, and that sort of overrode, or that was only overridden by the top state. So the way that this functions then is, if you look at it, it plays the base layers animation, goes into boot, and then based on whether or not the parameter solid is ticked, it'll go into the solid or into its mobile phase. Okay, remember these two are actually the exact same animation. The one is just played in reverse and much faster. Okay, so those were custom animations that are set up on the bottom layer, and this could be similar to your normal type locomotion events. So if we compare this to a more complicated character controller, it looks something like this is a very standard one. If we look at the combat controller, you'll see there's the base layer, which basically just involves him idling, walking, forward movement, crouching, crouch to stand rather. He can die from any state, which makes sense as well. So in this case, that's what happens on the base layer. Him climbing ladders and things like that. What's interesting about this is that in some cases, even though this is the base layer, you would still want to dynamically change the weight of this combat layer. So in other words, your character can't climb a ladder if it's holding a gun in its hand, and can't, or it might be able to take cover with that layer intact then. Let's just see how that, so it's left, sneak, taking cover, idle. I think all of that happens with a gun. An arm turning, that's obviously without a gun. Rest actions. Pick up, drinking. So you can perform all of these, some with guns and others without guns. Okay. Basically what it's doing though is it's only applying these actions and these animations on the upper body in this case. So you would still be able to move around. And I think that's mainly the way that this was split, that climbing the ladder, covering, turning, and all the rest actions basically involve the lower half of the body to do a specific thing, whereas the combat is independent of the lower body. So that's why this is set to override whatever actions are happening on the bottom layer. I think the reason why I made it 75% is only to have those animations be a little bit more subtle. Sometimes you find really cartoony animations and they just make the character look a little bit too cartoony, so that's a way of maybe dumbing down the animations and blending a little bit with the existing animations that are on there. So the idle, so these breathing rhythms and things sort of stay the same as well. Both of these layers have IK passes, so that's fine. So let's see how this fires off. Okay, so on the base layer is just going through his idles. On the combat layer, nothing is actually happening at this point in time. It's not influencing the bottom layer at all, because there's an empty. So you can create empty states as well with no animation on it, and then they won't affect. Obviously you have to have some animation playing, but it'll take the animation from what I mean by you have to have some animation playing is that you can't have one layer or both layers having null at the same time, because your character will just go into that sort of silly crumpled up sort of fetal position thing, default pose that it has. So you want the one to blend into something at least, and in this case it's playing the idle animation, and then it's just playing through this, waiting for further instructions. So I can go into my interactions from any state, or I can go into, or I can actually come back to the state from the combat layer. Okay, so that combat layer is in fact then in here, well in there, and the reason why I can't go in there is because it's live linking. So there I can actually see nothing has been triggered, it's only in its rest pose. So only once the parameters are set, so if I equip something, I think that's what I need to do. I need to set, what else do I need to do here? I need to sheath something? No. I need to set the sheath location. So I don't know if these, okay, these do actually still work. Come back. Sheath location, let's go. I don't know why it's, because I'm also clicking in the world. So my UI isn't currently being ignored by my raycast clicking, which is quite terrible actually. But if I switch here to rifle, Where's rifle? Action, weapon, weapon 1. Action, trigger. This is a little bit complicated if you're rusty. That's resting. I don't think this UI is actually firing off anything in there. Or no, it's not actually firing off anything. Sorry. It's not linked. Okay, so let's see. Sheath trigger. Okay, it took out a gun this time. Aim. Can you aim? Attack trigger? Okay, now he's aiming and shooting. Okay, let's auto live link again. See where we're at now. Okay, so we went into, from the combat trigger, we switched to the weapon, which was 1, so 1 equals rifle. See, this isn't a controller that you expect the player to control. Like, these parameters are set based on world influences. So if you have a rifle equipped in your inventory, then it's automatically going to set this animator's action to 1. So that's why an interface was sort of built for it to make it easier. Now, unfortunately, when I made this character controller, it was done in Bolt 2, which then was discontinued entirely. So yeah, those actions aren't set up. I'll set up another action controller for these so that you can control the animator a little bit better, but also keep in mind that it's not expected of you as an animator or as a player to puppeteer this this mess of a controller. They tend to do things at the moment, but they're not firing it off. If you can control them in here, then it's somewhat better than trying to control everything in here. Okay, so okay, shooting, he's reloading, he doesn't want to climb, he's not getting hit by anyone. Those aren't firing off at the moment. Crouching is firing off. Okay, so essentially makes it very difficult for this character controller to be controlled by just toggling parameters, because they're quite complex. Like, you can sheath from 3 different locations. So his hips or his back, actually, and that's just unsheathing, so it's putting it back. Then his left hip or right hip, or dual wield. Then you set triggers like equipping, or whether he's blocking with the with whatever he has, whatever he's wielding. So every single state. So this layer, basically, combat layer, has multiple substates for each. So you have the rest layer, which is now the null, but whenever it goes into shooting, based on those parameters, it can shoot and idle, and it can move, it can switch its weapons, it can have damage, it can block, and it can attack. And each one of those substates have a number of variables, so whether or not he's shooting this way or that way, and those are sort of set fairly randomly. So that's one kind of shooting. You'll notice that a lot of these animations don't have their lower bodies, because their lower bodies are deactivated by the... Oh, I did click something that at some point deactivated this layer, I can see. So there are controllers or scripts and some of these factors that are changing it. But hopefully that gives you an idea, let's try that again, of what the weighting and what the layers and how you can separate animations based on those. Cool, so if I just trigger this again, I think it was just making my weapon 1 and clicking equip or sheath trigger, sheath location 1. Okay, then finally takes out the gun. Okay, now that's my combat layer, that's the shooting animation, it's in the shooting substate, but since it's still entirely on another layer, I can just blend it out. So there, that's what it looks like at full, and then so if this character was walking around, Now he'll be walking around with the gun or without the gun. The mask that's set up here, you can grab from, well, actually you can just make a generic one. So I normally place those in my animation folder or the model. See if there's a mask. Where did I put my mask? Okay, but as easy as this, create animation mask. There it is, avatar mask. And so I just named that one upper body, but you could do just feet as well if you want to. And if you want to configure that, you can simply go in here in your inspector and say, okay, this mask should only influence the feet and the root. So then on that layer, you can simply go and select that other mask. So yeah, layers and masks are quite useful for splitting complexity. That example, I must say, is a little bit discouraging because there's so many states and substates and events being triggered simultaneously. It's not a very friendly example of using these parameters. So you can see how quickly a character controller can become almost unmanageable because of the complexity. That's why I suppose you could do this to alleviate some of that pain. If they're properly linked, then the UI will help. Otherwise, you would need to go and set up certain parameters, which is also something that's being done here, like these NPCs and things in the scene, and crouch areas and climb areas that have been set up as triggers so that you can test the functionality of your character as you go along. Okay, before we get too carried away with that though, the last place we left off, we went and visited our package manager. We grabbed both, well, I installed Bolt, Cinemachine, and the new input system. So let's just see if all of those are actually in here. Cool, so the input system is running, and I'm just going to clear that out for now. Our animator doesn't do much, and I don't think it's set up with root motion in mind, but for now, let's just see. Got locomotion. See what this one looks like. Okay, that could have been a 2D controller, but let's just keep it as is. So in other words, if I hit play and I give it some X value, which in this case should be Z because it's moving forward. Yeah, no. Okay, well there goes. Okay, so he has nothing on him that stops him from just walking through everything. You would need to add a couple of components to this character to make sure that you have control over him in general. So there's a couple of options in this case as well. You get a character controller component, which doesn't really listen to external physics, if you call it that way. You can have a look at what the character controller component does. It has a bunch of built-in functionality that's sorry, now I'm is the component? Sorry, one more time. It's easier to get there this way around. So it does not make use of rigid body physics. That's the main difference here. So character controller with root motion kind of works okay because you don't really use any other physical input. But if you're working with physics in your world, then I would actually recommend adding a rigid body rather and a collider. Normally not a box collider because, well, you want it to be smoother, so something like a capsule collider. You can also go and set the material on this if you find that it's getting stuck on things. You also have to just mind the placement of your character controller object, of course, I mean your collider object. So in this case, okay. What is that other component that I'm seeing there? Is that the controller? Yep. Okay. So I just got rid of that for now. Rigid body, capsule collider, mass makes a difference. Drag, obviously, angular. Anything that you change in this rigid body and the physical material affects the way that your character responds to your inputs. When you use the navmesh agent, you have similar settings, so some auto braking, speed that you can set. I suppose speed would be equivalent to drag to some degree. Okay, but mainly we're going to be applying forces or setting velocity of our rigid body to move our character around. In this case, since I'm still using root motion, I'm just adding a rigid body and a capsule collider so you can bump things around. So for fun, we can go and add a game object, a cube, and add a rigid body. And see what happens. Okay, so the rigid body is a little higher, or sticks out at the bottom a bit. That's why the character is floating. And if I set, is it X to 1 to active? Is it Z to 1? Hey, great. Okay, so he fell over. He's drunk. You need to set up the constraints on your rigid body so that he doesn't just fall over. Other than that, I think he would have been working fine. Let's give it another shot. So we freeze the rotation of the, let's just look at it. We don't want him spinning on the x-axis and we don't want him spinning on the z-axis. What was I putting? Oh, I put the constraints on the box, guys, not on the character. No one tells me. I'm like, what? Okay, so freeze the rotations on the character, not the box. Okay, so then that way at least, say active 1, character will push the box, and then when it walks, it's meant to fall off the edge. What's it getting stuck for? It's trying, it's because it's still playing the root motion. Oh, there you go. And the drag on the angular drag on the rigid body, so it sort of got stuck on the edge there. Okay, but it does fall off if it needs to, which is good. Except I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And then to navigate this better, we need to start bringing in some cameras, okay, which is actually what we want to look at. So we have a couple of options here. We already have our main camera, which if you don't have set up, Cinemachine is going to assume that that's the angle that you want the camera to be on. So if I could create a virtual camera, it basically picks that camera as the camera that it's using, and then adds a Cinemachine brain to that. Okay, and then it can then blend between various virtual cameras, but it's basically using this camera for its default inputs. Okay, the camera at this stage doesn't know who to follow or what to do, so you can go and tell it to follow your character or look at your character. And then again, based on the virtual camera settings, I can then go raise this a bit. There's offsets as well, so let me see, follow. Let's make that 9, maybe that's a bit high. Transposer, target, offset, so I can make that higher and look at his chest instead of his feet. It gives you this nice guides, so that you can sort of see what the camera is looking at. The aim composer allows you to do a little bit of dampening already. There's soft zones as well that you can set up, or dead zones. So this gives your character movement space within that area before the camera starts responding. Okay, so if you want to see what that looks like, the camera is going to try and follow this character around, but it's going to try and give it some time before it does that. So if I switch it to active and 1 again, so there's some wiggling happening here. The character's having some trouble with that box, so we're feeling a lot of this dampening. It's not responding very nicely at the moment. What you can do though, and what's nice about Cinemachine, is that if you have save during play on, you can literally go and tweak your camera as it's playing. So let's have my character walk into the box again. So what's not nice is at tracking, there's this horizontal dampening. Okay, so there's no look ahead, and there's no... So if we switch off all the dampening and simply work with the dead zones, what do we get then? It's trying to look at it, but it's doing a really shoddy job within that lock to target with world up. So okay, that at least gives us our camera in a static kind of pose. Ignore Y. Okay. Oh, also something that we need to keep in mind now is that our character, we're following the character here with the animations on it, and we're using root motion, so it's actually also picking up that rotational, those slight rotational movements on our character root. So if you're driving, the character with root motion, I think you should have a lot more dampening, or no. See what no, why. See, in the others, what I normally do is I would have a character with a root and then a target object inside that control object, but that control object is not the same object as the one with the animations on it. it's independent of the roots of the character, whereas with this one we're literally referencing. So if we just take a look at what that thing does, I think we'll find that there is a lot of rotation, unwanted rotation, that's being translated to our camera. Now if we ignored, or if we didn't use root motion, then that might not have been the case, because there's no root animation. So you'll immediately see the transposer, but now our character won't move because we have no other influence over it. So now there's no real input. I can move this around though, if I honestly want to just test the camera and just move my character around, see what the camera does. Let's see if we can get around that terrible shaking of the character. So I'm going to make the dead zone a little smaller again, so that we can focus on our character for longer, or keep a closer eye on it basically. And let's see. Okay, so we can't really tell until we get the root motion back on it. It's still shaking quite a bit. It's not allowing it as much freedom as before though. Okay, it's still quite rough, but like I said, you can go and tweak all those values as you play with it. What I normally just do as well, in my test scenes, you'll see that they normally have these sort of grids. Now I just use a shader for that. I don't think I used the. Oh, there's a grid. You can also just use a shader. I just enjoy having. See if I can just drag it in here. Having some point of reference so I can see what the camera is actually doing, because you don't get a clear view of what the camera is doing when there's no contrast in the world. So I guess normally I would go and create a folder for materials. And then just set the tiling to like something gives us some feedback. And we can have another look at the camera. Okay, so this is just the standard virtual camera. It comes with a transposer and a composer. You can choose to obviously ignore the aim completely. You can say do nothing, don't aim at it, just follow it around. You can switch out these for instead of transposers, you have orbital transposers, which allows you to orbit your character. And let me just see, it's meant to give you some more height, but that's also something that you just set up. Okay, so that's an orbital transposer. You can also, let's see, there's only X at the moment. Let's see if there's a third person transposer, or follow rather. It has more detail, like rig and shoulder offset, camera collision filtering. There's other filters that you can add, like noise, and other extensions like the collider in Cinemachine, that also keeps it out of other objects. I think the best thing to do is just go and play with these settings, try the different types of bodies on the cameras, see whatever works for you. I like the if you go to the free look camera, I don't see that in the body options over here. There's another one, free look camera. I'm going to switch off this virtual cam. The free look camera gives you, okay, just need to tell it to follow again. I need to look at, and once again I can go and offset the center, track the object offset, sorry, it should work. So what this camera allows you to do by default, let me just say, let's do 1 for now. You can kind of get an idea of what the camera is trying to do here by looking at the representation in the scene. So it goes from a top view to a bottom view using the mouse y-axis at the moment, and it orbits based on the mouse x-axis. Now you can go and change those input names to suit whatever you want it to be. So you can do, I think it's middle mouse scroll is the right term for it. I think I can also just check it here. So in this case, I actually have a state-driven camera that has the free look camera in it, and then a VR cam, which is sort of a POV camera, and then a vanity camera, which is kind of like a close-up camera looking back at the character for selfies and things, obviously. So what the state-driven camera is doing is simply making a list of all the other virtual cameras that you have, and then you can go and set up parameters for those to switch between the different types of cameras, the different types of virtual cameras. So if I just click on my free look camera, you'll see that I changed it to mouse scroll wheel. Sorry, I did get the naming wrong there. It's called mouse scroll wheel. Correct input. And then, whoops, and then my mouse scroll wheel will actually determine the zoom instead of my mouse Y. And what you can also do then with the free look is that you can go and set up the different bodies. So there's the top rig. So that means that the top tier, let's look at the middle rig here for a second and just say, that's the way it behaves. But here in the very top, you can also say what the height and the radius is. So I can make this middle level a lot further, maybe even make the top rig way wider that way, and higher as well. That way if I zoom out and in, and I can zoom all the way to his feet and zoom all the way up to his, like almost top down, while also still orbiting this character. And that's just a free look camera. So it's kind of cool. The components that we're adding to it will obviously reference the position of this camera as well, so we can move our character accordingly. Just quickly another glance at that state-driven camera. Sorry guys, going over time, just 2 seconds, I'll wrap it up. In this one, the animator is being referenced for changes in the camera. So if we go to this character, player controller, look at the parameters, currently action trigger, and what was the other event? I think action trigger is firing off these states. Set it up like that. So oh, I actually just attached them to states already existing on the controller. So in this case, interaction is set as the state that it needs to switch to that camera as soon as that state's entered, and the state is entered by pressing the action trigger. So all of these are just using the action trigger. So if I play this, and you keep an eye on the cameras that are being used, then it's currently using the free look camera, so it can zoom in and out and orbit the character, and as soon as I trigger the action trigger, it's going to switch to the first person view of that character. So it did that briefly because it exits the state after it's played the animation, so that's why it switches back. But basically what you're doing is you're linking the cameras to the different actions. So you can actually build an animator for your camera rig as well if you wanted to switch between different views. Cool.